Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm Melissa, and this is Mastering the DBQ. So welcome. Thanks for coming tonight. If you are out there in the chat, why don't you just type one word that describes how you're feeling about the DBQ right now? I know that it can be really nerve-wracking for a lot of people, so I just want to hear kind of how are people feeling about the DBQ these days. Speaking of tonight, here is our game plan. What is the DBQ? Because some of you might be wondering what we're even talking about. Some of you have one coming up tomorrow in class, so you're really interested in some specifics, but I'll give a general overview first. We'll talk about what earns points on the DBQ so that you know the things you have to do in order to be successful. I'm going to talk you through a sample prompt and one sample document from DBQ that I created based on some sources from a couple of different places. I know some common fears that students have that I want to address, but definitely also want to talk about your questions as well. I'll give a general outline for writing and then save some time at the end for Q&A. I already see some questions popping up in the question boxes. So let me take a look at those before we dive in and see what's going on. So the first question someone's asking just about me. Have you ever graded a DBQ for the College Board? Yes, I have. In 2017, I was a reader for the AP World History exam, and I scored both the LEQ and the DBQ. So yes, that is something I know some about. We've also got a question that is pretty time period specific. I'm guessing that's the topic of your DBQ or perhaps your essay for tomorrow. And if we get to that a little bit later, if we have some time, we'll talk about that. But I want to dive right into the DBQ specifically. We've got a lot of people wondering a lot of different things. So let's just start very briefly. What is the DBQ? Most broadly, the document-based question, that's what it stands for. Document-based question is your chance to show both knowledge and skill in your own words. So hopefully at this point, you know that the AP World History exam includes both multiple choice and free response questions. The DBQ is one of those free response where you're writing in your own words about your own knowledge. You're going to develop and support an argument about a topic relating to a prompt that you're asked about, and you're demonstrating skills in understanding sources and making connections, both between sources and connections between sources and your knowledge of world history. So this is a really big task. On the AP exam, some nuts and bolts, you get 60 minutes, roughly speaking, to answer one DBQ, one document-based question. That 60 minutes includes an estimated 15 minutes of reading time for a set of documents and a prompt, and then 45 minutes of writing time. And you are actually free to manage your time however you like, but that's the estimated time that the College Board expects students should spend on this process. Each DBQ includes 7 documents to analyze and incorporate, at least one of which will be a visual. So you're getting a set of documents. It's not all one document. It's a set of excerpts, usually, from primary source documents. Most of them will be text, but there will be sometimes a painting or a map or a chart or some other kind of visual or data analysis that's different from text that you'll also include. The DBQ will cover the period from 1450 to the present. So that first section of time on the AP World History exam, 1200 to 1450, will be addressed in other parts of the exam. And certainly some of that knowledge can come into play on a DBQ, but the primary topic of the DBQ is going to be 1450 to the present. And it represents 25% of your overall exam score. So this is a worthwhile chunk of learning. Getting good at writing the DBQ is worth your time because it has a advantage to your score to be good at this particular essay. So again, staying in the big overview realm, let's talk about what earns the points. There are 7 points on the DBQ, and I'm not going to go through the rubric point by point because I want to get us into some practice, and I want to be really practical and answer your questions as much as possible. But there's 4 categories of points, so those 7 points break down into 4 categories, and I just want to go through those 4 categories of points for you. The first is the thesis. And I saw a number of people in the polls who are really concerned about writing the thesis. So let's kind of talk big picture here first, and then we can dive into some nuts and bolts on what a thesis should look like. From the College Board rubric, the thesis needs to do 2 things. It needs to develop a historically defensible claim, and it needs to establish a line of reasoning. So let's talk about what those terms mean. Can anybody in the chat, this is a place where you can be interactive, can you give me a working definition for what we mean by historically defensible? For writing something that's historically defensible, what does that mean? And this is where there's just a little bit of dead air because I know there's a delay in you hearing my voice and you typing. So I would love to see some answers from folks out there about historically defensible. Oh, people are being, oh, there we go. All right, responses are popping in. Using historical facts to argue a point has to be provable. You have to be able to prove your thesis with historical knowledge, making an argument. Those are all good responses. Historically defensible is actually even a little bit broader than that. I like the word provable. You have to be able to prove your thesis with historical knowledge. In kind of the broadest terms, historically defensible means that it's plausible, that it's not just some crazy out there idea. It needs to be historically reasonable. It could be proved. And the good news with historically defensible is that there's not one right answer. There are multiple possible correct and valid answers that could work for any document-based question you receive. So a historically defensible claim is an argument. Claim is another word for argument or assertion. So you're going to take a stand, make a claim. It should be plausible, should be historically defensible. There's some evidence out there that's probably going to back it up, and establish a line of reasoning. So the way I like to think of this is you're going to state your claim and you're going to give a broad because statement within your thesis. So when we look at a sample prompt, we can maybe do a couple of trial thesis statements with that sample prompt for those of you wanting to write some thesis statements today. But it needs that claim and the because. And if you want a really superior high-level thesis statement, you would also include a counterclaim. And I'm going to go into the idea of counterclaims and complex argumentation in my stream on the 7th about analysis and reasoning. And I just want to put it out there that you can start building your complex argument right in your thesis. The second category of points that you can earn on the DBQ is for contextualization. And it's describing the broader context that's relevant to the prompt. Amanda, our Fiveable founder, actually has a really great metaphor for thinking about context. Context is that little teaser right before an episode of a TV show where they say previously on, and they give you, right, like what else has been happening. And sometimes the previously on relates directly to the specific events of the episode. It's more causation. But a lot of times it's just like, who are the characters? What are their relationships? How does that all work together? History has a previously on. What else is going out in the world that might have a connection or a relevance to a particular topic that the prompt is asking you? And your context, you should state that broad idea and you should link it back in some way to how the prompt can happen. I like to link thesis and context together, and I'll talk about that a little bit later and why. But I think that those two really go neatly together. So you can think about, I take my broad context, I link it to this claim with reasoning that I'm trying to develop. And that makes the introduction to my essay. Third category for points is you're going to support your argument with evidence. If it's a historically defensible claim, if it's provable, pick the facts that are going to prove it and explain how they do that. You're going to need 2 kinds of evidence in a DBQ. And this is actually a place where a lot of the points are earned because the thesis is worth 1 point. Context is worth 1 point. Evidence is worth up to 3 points. 1 point is for using evidence, just having evidence from at least 3 documents. You can earn 2 points if you have evidence from 6 of the 7 documents, and if that evidence is explained to support an argument. If there's some way that you're connecting that evidence back to an argument. And then that third evidence point comes from thinking of a piece of evidence that you know about world history that it isn't in any of the documents and bringing that in to support an argument. So finding the evidence and using that evidence to support your ideas is a huge part of where you earn points on the DBQ. And then the fourth category of points, the last 2 points, are for analysis and reasoning. And I'm going to do a stream on analysis and reasoning in a couple weeks, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight, but it's something called sourcing. Thinking about the source of your documents and how that impacts your use of the documents, and then demonstrating complex understanding throughout the entirety of your essay. And that's the one that I call the unicorn point. That's why I have my magical unicorn on the slide here, is just the idea that this 1 point, this complexity point, is wonderful and magical and special and kind of hard to explain. Which doesn't mean we shouldn't strive towards it. It just means that it's a little mysterious, and if we don't ever quite get there, we're still in really good shape with the rest of our essay. So those are the 4 categories of points. I'm seeing another question in the box, so let me take a look at that before we move on to my next section. All right. So I've got a question here that asks, do you use multiple documents in one paragraph? Okay. So do you use multiple documents in one paragraph or a separate paragraph for each question? This is a fantastic question, Mark. I really appreciate you asking about using the documents. It doesn't matter, is the true answer. In terms of the way the rubric is structured, if you are using your evidence to support an argument in response to the question, it doesn't matter how many documents are in each paragraph. I think from my years of teaching this and from scoring this, that the strongest essays are going to use multiple documents together in body paragraphs. That's the strongest, most complex way to do this, but it's not the only way to do this. The most important thing for all of this advice I'm giving you about DBQs is that you need to answer the prompt using evidence. And whatever structure you do that in is up to you. Your teachers, students out there, your teachers may have different expectations and different requirements for what you're supposed to do for class. I tend to set the bar higher in my classroom than the College Board sets on the exam because I want my students to strive for excellence. So do what your teacher is asking you. And also know that if you forget to do one of those things on the AP exam, it's probably not the end of the world. So I hope that answers that question. I'm also seeing a question in the chat. The DBQ seems to be a synthesis essay. Is that correct? Not necessarily. We'll look at a prompt here in just a second, and I'll kind of show you a possibility for how DBQ is going to be answered. What we're really talking about here is an essay using primarily evidence from documents. That's what we mean by a document-based question. We want to be bringing together the documents. We could synthesize them, if that's a word that your teacher is using. But we could use the documents in a lot of different ways and still be successful. So big picture, like the process. What are you supposed to do when you receive, either in class or on the exam, a packet of documents? It's going to have a prompt at the top, some directions bullet pointed for you, and then 7 documents. And you're wondering, what do I do? So here's kind of the basic game plan for what you can do. Number 1, read and analyze the question first. Some students really struggle with the DBQ because they misunderstand what the question is asking And so they analyze the documents for the wrong purpose. So understanding the question can help you understand the documents, because you're not just trying to understand the documents in a vacuum, you're understanding them toward a purpose. So always take the time to read through and understand the prompt. And we're going to do that together on the next slide, I think. Before you even start reading the documents, I encourage my students to brainstorm what you already know about the topic. It's likely that the documents will overlap some of the knowledge you already have about a particular topic, but it's also possible that some of your knowledge won't show up in any of the documents, and there you already have your outside evidence point wrapped up because you've brainstormed and you know what information you might want to include. So read and analyze the question, brainstorm what you already know, then you go into those 7 documents, and you're going to take some time. You're going to take, probably 13 of your 15 minutes, because you spent 2 minutes on the prompt, 13 minutes to read and analyze 7 documents. There's 2 parts to each document. And again, we'll look at a sample in just a minute. But there's the source line that tells you a little bit about the context, the author, or the purpose of a document, which is really awesome. Hang on, I've got a visitor. Hey, good night and goodbye. Nope, I'm talking to the kids. You got to go. Sorry, that was my kiddo wanting to say good night. The source line, which we'll look at, and then the text or the visual itself that includes the details that are going to become your evidence. And again, we'll look at a sample of those. Evan is making a really great point in the chat that if you don't brainstorm, you risk tunnel vision. And that's absolutely correct. If you read the prompt and you think you know what the answer is going to be about, and then the documents are leaning to a different direction, it can be a little bit jarring. So yeah, read that prompt, brainstorm what you know, then read the documents, both the source line and the document itself. As you're reading, read with an eye toward answering the question, right? How does this document answer my question? Or how does this document fit into an answer to my question? You might not know right away, but maybe by the time you get to document 3, suddenly document 1 makes a little bit more sense. So you'll just read through those documents. And then I've already been saying this a lot, but I'm probably going to say it 50 more times in the rest of this stream. You're going to write an essay that answers the prompt using evidence from your own knowledge and from each of the documents. I heard a joke over the summer at a AP Teachers Conference that AP stands for answer the prompt. And really, if that is the only skill that you took away from your class all year long, that's really going to help you on the exam, and it's going to help you in college, right? Answer the question that's being asked. You can write the most beautiful, thoughtful piece of writing in the world, but if it doesn't answer the question, it doesn't matter, and no one's going to really care what you have to say, which is a harsh, ugly truth about the adult world. But if you learn how to answer the question, you can then develop those skills of making it sound smart or look beautiful or any of that good stuff. All right. I'm seeing another question in the box. So let's take a look at this. Is a DBQ the same thing as being asked a question for an essay based off of a textbook? Look, that's a great question. And no, it's not. A document-based question is going to have 7 individual specific documents. Very rarely, although on occasion, one of those documents might come from a secondary source, maybe a map or a chart that kind of compiles data from multiple different sources. But in general, they're going to be primary sources. So it'll be sources from the time period that you're being asked about, directly relating to the topic of the prompt. So unless your teacher is using a primary source textbook to ask you questions, a document-based question is going to look pretty different from that. So that actually is a great transition for me to, let's look at a couple of sample pieces. So I compiled, I'm not going to say I wrote a DBQ, I compiled a DBQ from a few different places, reworded a question, and pulled together some documents to create a sample DBQ that we could use for tonight. if you scroll down to below where the video is streaming on your screen, you should see a couple of resources related to this stream. One of those is a link to the Google Doc that has the DBQ in it. And if you want to open that link and make yourself a copy, you can annotate along with me as we look at a couple of parts of that DBQ. We're just going to start looking at the prompt, right? We're going to do the first part of the process together. So here's the prompt. Let's just take a look at it and read it together. Develop an argument that evaluates the extent to which cultural traditions or belief systems affected the attitudes toward merchants and trade in the period 1200 to 1600. Okay, so there's our prompt. What are some of the key phrases or ideas that you're seeing in the prompt itself? I'm seeing some people already start asking some or answering with some ideas, brainstorming, but let's just break down, like, what is the prompt asking? So what are some of those key phrases that help you know what the prompt is asking you? Okay, merchants. Yep, I circled merchants last, so I'll get to there. But merchants and trade. Yep, we need to be paying attention to merchants and trade. What else do we need to be thinking about? Belief systems. Yep. So the first thing I want to draw our attention to is actually the wording of the question itself. It's develop an argument. So this phrase is going to show up in pretty much every long essay question and document-based question from the College Board. And it seems really high level, college-y, university level kind of asking. And really all this means is you need a thesis, you need evidence, you need reasoning. That's what it means to develop an argument, is to have those three things. So really what this is saying is write an essay. Okay, so when you see that phrase, develop an argument, it means write an essay, don't panic. This phrase here, evaluates the extent to which, has been really common over the last couple of years in both sample prompts and actual released items from the College Board. So we can't guarantee they're going to continue to use the same language forever, but it's language they're using a lot right now, so we want to notice what that means. This evaluates the extent to which is an important part of the question. Evaluate means to determine the significance of. And this extent to which phrase gives us some flexibility to answer a how much question or a why not question. And so I'm seeing a couple people in the chat having a little debate about what this question is actually asking us about. And this question is asking us about how cultural traditions or belief systems that exist in the world, how did those things affect the attitudes of that place, probably, toward merchants and trade? So how would the cultural traditions or belief systems of a place in the world affect the attitudes toward merchants and trade in that part of the world? Okay, we've seen a comment, oh, this would be how China looked down on merchants and praised the working class, not the beliefs of the merchants. Potentially, yes. So you're already starting to brainstorm here. And if other people want to jump in the chat and brainstorm some ideas of connections you already know about cultural traditions or belief systems, so it could be religious or it could just be cultural, and how that impacts attitudes toward trade and merchants in different areas. We've got an example from China. What about other places in the world? Yeah, so these are great comments. People are saying, remembering what you know about China and the attitude toward merchants or toward trade in China. What else? What about the Middle East, or what about Europe? Okay, African Atlantic slave trade, possibly. We do see that this prompt is getting us up to 1600. That puts us really late in the time period, but it's possible. So well, let's brainstorm. What are some of the major cultural traditions or belief systems? Vanessa's jumping in with Islam, right? Do we know anything about Islam and its attitude toward merchants or trade? Yeah, Islam praised merchants. How come? Okay, we know that Islam was spread through trade networks and through merchants. So, it's likely that there was at least some support of merchants in Islamic areas. We might also remember that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, was a merchant before he was a prophet. And so there is an element where in Islam, trade and merchants, at least early on, are respected. What's our dominant belief system in Europe? If we were going to see European documents, what might we expect to see? Okay, so 1200 to 1600, we're in the Middle Ages in Europe. We've got kings and queens, sure. Belief systems. What are some of the cultural traditions or belief systems, hint, hint, that we might expect to think about if we're thinking about Europe? Because we've thought about China, we've thought about the Middle East and the Islamic world. What about in Europe? Christianity. Vanessa, you're on it with our belief systems tonight. Yes, that's right. Christianity. So we've got a couple of forms of Christianity, depending on where in Europe you are. But do we know anything about the attitudes of Christians or of Europeans toward trade and merchants? And if you don't know yet, that's okay, because remember, we're going to have documents to help us out. All right, people either furiously typing or they're a little nervous or they've forgotten my question, and that's okay. No worries, Josiah. We're thinking about 1200 to 1600. We're just trying to brainstorm things we already know about cultural traditions and belief systems and the connections toward trade or toward merchants. We know that in China, merchants are historically looked down upon because they were viewed with suspicion by Confucianists. We know that in the Middle East, Islam is a major tradition that supports merchants for a variety of reasons. We know that Christianity is the dominant belief system in Western Europe. And during this time period, 1200 to 1600, Europeans actually get more and increasingly involved in trade. Trade had declined early on, but they're increasingly involved and connected to trade networks. And so we may not exactly know the connection between Christianity and attitudes towards trade, but we know that we should think about Christianity as a possibility. And we should hope that the documents are going to give us something to work with there. Right? One of the things to take comfort in with the DBQ is that you're always going to have some documents to help you out. The documents aren't going to give you everything, but the documents are going to give you something. So you can take what you know, and if you're like, this isn't enough, okay, so take what you know and add to it from these 7 documents to think about how you might create a thesis and then develop that over the course of your essay. So this is the prompt itself that we're looking at right here. Any questions about this prompt in particular or analyzing the prompt in general as a part of the DBQ process? Pause here and answer questions about that before we take a look at a document together. While you think about questions, I'm going to drink some water so that I can be heard for the rest of this live stream. Okay, so we've got a great question here. Does the phrase cultural traditions generally mean religion? So because I wrote this prompt, I actually included cultural traditions to allow us to extend beyond religion. Belief system is going to generally mean religion or philosophies, that kind of thing. But cultural traditions could go beyond that, could be much broader than that. Hierarchies, I'm seeing the question there about hierarchies. Hierarchies would be more of a social characteristic of a civilization. It doesn't necessarily exclude it from your discussion in the essay, but cultural could be things like, trying to think of non-religious cultural traditions. Literary or artistic, or just like general things that are true of a group of people that don't necessarily relate to religion. Okay. Yeah, culture's point of view. That's a great way to think about cultural traditions. Absolutely. So, once you have analyzed this prompt, right, you want to jump into the documents themselves. We're not going to go through all 7 documents tonight because I'm already keeping my East Coast friends up way later than I really like to. And at some point, we're all going to need to get some sleep before we write a DBQ in the morning. So let's take a look at one document. And if you don't have a copy of the Google Doc in front of you, this might be a little bit tricky to see, but I'll read you what it says so that you can get a sense of what we got here. So I started with an image document, just because that was document 1 in the DBQ that I created. This is a painting from the Buddhist cave temples at, Bezeklik in Central Asia, circa 800 CE. The painting shows the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas blessing Central Asian traders bearing gifts for the Bezeklik temples. Okay, so I'm seeing some folks struggling with resources. So if you don't have a Plus membership and you can't see the resources, this is the only document that we're going to look at tonight. And future streams, generally speaking, when we're dealing with documents, we're going to include them on our slides. You'll be able to see them on screen. You just won't be able to necessarily annotate along with us. So fear not, walk you through it. It'll be okay. The nice thing about this painting is that the source line here at the top gives us a lot of information that might be difficult to intuit or interpret from the image itself. Can you hang on just a second, guys? Can you turn the lights back on? Sorry, my family's like doing stuff around me and they turn the lights off in here. There we go. That's a little bit better. So we've got this figure of the Buddha in the center of the image. We have some figures near the top who are bodhisattvas. We have some Central Asian traders bringing gifts and apparently receiving a blessing. I'm not sure without the source line that I would have known that. So I'm thankful that the source line gives me a little bit of detail and help. So for this one, feel free to jump in the chat if you see things I'm not seeing, but I already went through this one and made some observations, and I want to point those out to you. So I've underlined and circled some things in the source line, but my specific observations, so as I'm looking at this document, the first thing I observed is something that I'm also seeing from Mark here, which is that this document is talking to us about Buddhism. And so if we're thinking about belief systems, okay, Buddhism is a major belief system in the world in between 1200 and 1600. So we can work with a Buddhist document. Great. That's really helpful to know, right? It tells us it's the Buddha, which should be a great thing to know. The Bodhisattvas are also holy figures in Buddhism. So we're good there. Location, the source line also gives us the location. This painting itself is from Central Asia, and the humans depicted in the painting are depicted as Central Asian merchants or traders themselves, coming to receive their blessing from the Buddha. So that's putting us at a location geographically. We've got a context belief system-wise. The time period, I got to admit, when I was compiling this DBQ, I fudged a little to include this document on the time period. Because, of course, the question is asking you 1200 to 1600, because the College Board is asking us to focus our attention on world history from 1200 to 1600. But this was such a beautiful document that even though it comes from around 800, I think it's well representative of processes that were continuing to happen in the 1200s. Mark's asking, wasn't this right during the height of the Silk Roads? Certainly the Silk Roads had developed much earlier than this painting and much, much earlier than the time period of this prompt. But the Silk Roads by the 1200s are, yes, coming up to really their height of extent and numbers of travelers and traders moving along them. So we can definitely make some Silk Road connections, even though this particular document is technically outside the time period of our prompt. College Board will put them all in the time period of your prompt. I was working with what I had, and this is just such a beautiful painting. I wanted to include it. So someone's already got me thinking about India, which is something I'm going to say here in just a minute. But as I'm doing like just observations of the source itself, we've got traders that are being blessed by the Buddha. So right there from these observations, I can start to think about how am I going to connect this document to the prompt. I see that there's a positive view of trade, right? The merchants are receiving a blessing from the divine figure of the Buddha. So right there, I know that this isn't a belief system, at least in Central Asia, this isn't a belief system that is really down on merchants and trade. These guys aren't being treated with disdain or disrespect. They're not being treated with suspicion. They are being blessed. So that could be really helpful for me to think that at least some religions supported merchants and trade. This is Central Asia. And so then I want to ask, okay, I know that Buddhism is in a lot of different regions between 1200 and 1600. So what do I know about Buddhism in those other places? What do I know about Buddhism in India? What do I know about Buddhism in China? And if I have a piece of outside knowledge that could be relevant in connection with this document, that could be really helpful. In general, I know that Buddhism was founded in India. You're right, look. But that may or may not be the most useful piece of information that I know. I also know that Buddhism, similar to Islam, is a universalizing religion that was spread along trade networks and spread in many cases by merchants going to new parts of the world. So the link between Buddhism and trade is long-standing and significant. Josiah's already asking the next question that I need to think about, right? Because analysis, not just using the documents for evidence, but analyzing the source behind the document is something that we need to think about. Josiah is saying that this painting might come from someone with a bias towards Buddhism. And in general, I'm going to advise you, like I advise my students, not to use the word bias if you can possibly avoid it. Bias is often seen by AP readers as kind of a lazy word for analysis. Instead, we might want to acknowledge that there's a purpose behind this painting. This is a painting at a temple. And the painting at the temple is showing traders or merchants who brought gifts for the temple getting a blessing. So if I came to the temple and I saw this painting, oh, those guys who brought gifts received a blessing. What is that supposed to make me want to do? Gives gifts at the temple. So this painting, it might be, we could say maybe that it's biased towards Buddhism because it's probably a Buddhist painting. It's certainly in a Buddhist temple, but it's probably more helpful to say that, hey, this painting is trying to encourage other merchants, other traders, other travelers who come to visit the temple to be like the merchants in the painting, to give their gifts in order to receive the same favor that the painting is depicting. And so when we think about between Buddhism and trade, we have to acknowledge that this painting and its purpose may have emphasized a certain positive relationship between trade and Buddhism, and that perhaps other Buddhist sources would not have had the same view. They could have had a contrary view or just simply a more neutral view about trade because they're not operating from the same purpose. So I would do essentially the same process much more quickly for each of the 7 documents. I did it slowly here with you so that I could talk it out loud. You're never going to need to talk these out loud unless your teacher does that as an assignment. But on the exam, you're not talking about these documents, and you don't even have to write everything that you see on my screen out in words. You could think all of this and write very little on your paper. But essentially, you want to do this process. You want to read the source line, look at the text or the visual of the document, make your observations. What do you notice? And then connect those observations to the prompt itself. How does what I've seen in this document help me to answer the question that I've been asked? So at this point, we've talked about what is the DBQ. We've talked about the scoring categories. We've looked at a prompt. We've looked at a document. And so now I want to turn a question back to you. I have a few things still that I can talk about, but I want to ask you this one. When you think about the DBQ, and for some of you, this is very real. We've been getting questions all afternoon from folks who have a DBQ assigned tomorrow in class. What makes you most nervous about this big picture process? You can ask your questions in the chat or in our question function. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about and write out your questions. I'm going to keep talking while you do that so that it's not awkward dead air. And I'm going to talk about some of the common fears that students have, but I definitely want to hear your questions or your concerns, even in the middle of while I'm talking, so that I can make sure I'm answering those things, because you showed up live, so you get your questions answered. All right, we've already got one from Mark before I dive into mine. I'm most nervous about organizing my thoughts. I don't want to waste time, but I definitely want to have my thoughts organized. Mark, that's a very reasonable concern and a very thoughtful thing that you're doing already. Thinking, okay, I want to be organized, but I don't want to waste time. My suggestion would be to start thinking about what tools you know how to use that can help you to create an organizational structure quickly. So for example, if you got a prompt that was comparative, you might be a person who draws a quick Venn diagram, jots down a couple of bullet points in your Venn diagram, and that visual then reminds you of what you are going to do. If you're not a particularly visual person, I've also had students do a quick bullet point outline, and it doesn't have to be beautiful, right? Because nobody's scoring your outline, but by bullet pointing their ideas, and even if it's just keyword bullet pointing, they remember the topics that they want to address in each body paragraph. That's another thing I've seen students do. I've seen students draw timelines. So I would say find a tool that you can create quickly and that is helpful for you to remember. And so then you can eventually scale that tool down to its very most minimal components. And we have to remember this is a process, right? In October, we're all working a lot more slowly and a lot harder because we're not good at this yet. And by May, you will be much better at this process and you're going to be more confident and it's going to seem easier because you're good at it now. So that's kind of an answer to that first question. Got another question here. My biggest challenge is knowing what information is the best to include when answering the prompt. And it is hard to transform the information into an answer for the prompt, how to make it into an argument. Yeah, those are some very real challenges. The information that's best to include when answering the prompt is the information that most clearly answers the prompt. So most easily. And with the documents, you want to maybe pick one idea from each of the 7 documents. You need to use all of the documents if possible. So don't try and use 5 things from one single document. Pick one fact that relates best. And always remember that it's your argument that is the key, not the one true right answer. There are multiple good, valid, and even beautiful answers to any of these DBQs. So whichever information most closely connects to the idea you understand best is going to serve you well. Okay, I've got one more question from Sierra, and then I want to talk you through some general concerns I've seen students do. So this is a specific question. For compare and contrast DBQs, how do we organize that? So you must be writing the Han and Roman attitudes towards technology. The good news about a compare and contrast question, whether it is DBQ or long essay question, is that you can organize it in a lot of different ways and still be successful. You could do a paragraph of similarities and a paragraph of differences. You could do a paragraph that focuses on a single thematic aspect, so a single type of technology. I've seen that DBQ, but I'm not super familiar with it. So if there's like certain types of technology that they had similar attitudes about, and then other types of technologies where they really differed, could organize it that way. You could do it by region. Here's what the Romans thought, here's what the Han Chinese thought, and then try and do your comparative analysis in a third paragraph. I think that's the hardest way to do it, honestly, but you can do whatever is going to get you an answer to the question. There isn't a single perfect way to organize any particular essay. Okay, Josiah's asking, if you have 2 out of 6 documents that have a neutral view, how would you be able to incorporate that into your DBQ? If I'm understanding what you mean by neutral view, you're not going to have any documents with a neutral view. Every document is created by a human being, and it has, that human being has a point of view. That human being has a purpose for creating that document. That document was created in a historical context. That document was created for a particular audience. And you, as the AP student, are not the audience that these documents were created for, right? If a document was created 1,000 years ago, it wasn't created for you, which isn't a criticism of you. What it means is that if you think about who it was created for, that can help you to understand the limitations of a document or the value of a document when you're doing that sourcing analysis. And I'm going to go into that in more detail in 2 weeks when I do my stream about analysis and reasoning. You can use every document for evidence, and you can use just about any document for sourcing. So here are 4 things that students routinely express to me as being really concerning. The biggest one people say they're worried about is time. And a number of you indicated in my poll that you were also really worried about time. So one strategy for dealing with the time issue is practice. And that's really hard because you're like, but I have to write it tomorrow. And how am I going to manage the time tomorrow? You're going to do your best tomorrow because it's October. And your teacher knows that you're not good at this yet. You will be good at it someday, but you're not great at it in October. Nobody is. As you go through, you're going to continue practicing with samples, and you're going to practice them in class, and you're going to come to Fiveable live streams and practice them with us, and you're going to do whatever other review tools help you feel confident to practice with these samples. I also advise people on the actual exam, write the DBQ first and then the LEQ. The LEQ is always going to be shorter, and you can usually borrow some time from the LEQ to give yourself really that full 60 minutes. And if it has to be 65 minutes to write your LEQ, you can absolutely do that. Mark is asking about bringing a watch to the exam. If you wear a watch, bring a watch to the exam. Just make sure it doesn't beep or connect to the internet. But if you have an old school watch that you wear to help you keep track of time, absolutely do it. There's no guarantee that you're going to be sitting near a clock in the room that you're testing in. My students at my school test in the gym because there's so many of them taking the test. And some of them sit near the clock and some of them don't. So having a watch is great. If you're a person who doesn't wear a watch or can't read an analog clock, either practice now or don't do it. Whatever's going to make you the most comfortable. Second concern people have is understanding the documents. Just like, what does this document even say? 2 tips for that. Tip number 1, read that source line. right? For the image that we looked at together, and I'll actually just jump back to it because it's kind of like, what, right? If you look at this image, you might not know exactly what's going on in the image, but the College Board provided that source line to help you know what's going on in the image. So read that source line. I think it's comforting to know that the College Board assumes that you're a 10th grader. If you're not a 10th grader, the College Board is assuming, because the vast majority of students taking this test are 10th graders. So that's kind of the level of knowledge and experience that they're assuming, which means that the basic understanding that you get from a document is often good enough. You don't have to have the most in-depth understanding. Your teacher is going to pull things out of a document that you might never in a million years have noticed in that document. And it doesn't mean that you aren't really smart. It doesn't even mean that you're not good at this skill. What it means is that you found the obvious one, which is great, and your teacher, who has years more experience with this kind of analysis than you do, found something else, and that's okay. Third common fear that people have is dealing with sourcing or point of view. You're going to need to do that process with 3 documents. And I know I keep saying I'm going to talk about it in 2 weeks, but I'm just trying to be respectful of people's time and acknowledge that I can't go into all of it today. So just know you need to do this process of sourcing for 3 of the documents. And I always tell my students, pick the 3 easiest, the 3 with the most obvious point of view or the most obvious purpose. If there's one that seems too neutral, like Josiah was concerned about, don't do that for sourcing. Pick a different one, right? That'll be fine. And you only need to analyze one aspect of sourcing. You don't have to do point of view and purpose and audience and. You need to use the documents, the evidence from the document, but you don't have to do the sourcing analysis. So those are different skills that are being measured. So use evidence from each document. Source 3 of the documents. As you're using evidence from the documents, you're going to want to paraphrase, not quote from the documents. This may be a little radical. Some teachers may disagree with me on this. I say whenever possible, don't quote. Paraphrase. Your reader is expected to be familiar enough with the documents that they can identify the evidence that you're pulling in, even if it's paraphrased. Paraphrasing it puts it into your own words, which connects it more closely to your argument. And that's what we want. I don't want a bunch of random quotes showing me that, yeah, you read the document. What I want is for you to take that document and use it to prove the claim that you made in your thesis. So that's what you should be aiming for. So you have to use at least 6 of the documents. Please use all 7 documents so that if you get one wrong, you're still safe. But so you're going to use all 7 documents. You're going to pull evidence out of them. You're going to take it into your own words, and you're going to use those words to expand on and defend that historically defensible thesis that you created in your introduction. And that's the big idea in terms of using the documents. So I'm going to pause right here. And Sierra's got another question I want to look at. Sierra, I'm going to be honest, I'm not familiar enough with the Han and Roman attitudes toward technology, DBQ, to comment on the approach that you chose. I really appreciate that you're asking that question. I think this is a fantastic question to ask your teacher specifically. If you've got a teacher that you're working with, if you're doing this independent study, that's a little bit trickier. But if you've got a teacher you're working with in class, take this exact question, this exact concern, and ask your teacher about it and see if your teacher will work with you to develop your approach. Because I'm just, like I said, not familiar enough with your DBQ. Big picture though, as you're structuring your essay, this is the guideline that I give to my students. Rather than saying there's one formula that fits everything, I say like, here's a really broad formula that you can adapt as you need to. I always suggest that the introductory paragraph be your context and your thesis, because those 2 things go so well together. You take the broad idea, you link it to your argument, Bam, you're done. 2 points out of the way in your intro paragraph. You notice that I just say body. I don't specify a number of body paragraphs. You write as many body paragraphs as it takes to fully support that argument from your thesis with evidence. You're going to choose evidence from the documents. You're going to choose evidence from beyond the documents. You are going to do some sourcing analysis, and you're going to explain your reasoning for all of it. And you're going to do that for as long as it takes. Some of you are going to do it in 2 paragraphs. Some of you are going to do it in 3 paragraphs. Some of you are going to do it in 4 paragraphs. Some of you will forget to create paragraphs, and you will just write a long, beautiful run-on DBQ. It will be fine. You are supporting your argument. That's the point. Conclusion, I always suggest that you restate your thesis in new words in your conclusion. But the big idea here is you answer the prompt, you use evidence to answer the prompt, and you answer the prompt some more. Because AB stands for answer the prompt. And no matter what structure you use, or how good your formatting is, or your spelling, or your conventions of any kind, if you are answering the prompt, you are setting yourself up for success. Make a claim, give some reasoning, expand on that with evidence, and explain your thinking throughout the course of your essay using the documents, and that's the key to a good DBQ. All right. So finally, some big questions time. You guys have been asking great questions, but let's continue to ask some questions. Mark says, would you recommend including our reasoning to our thesis within separate claims in each paragraph? Yes. And focus more on writing a convincing argument than flexing our historical knowledge. Not necessarily to the second question. So yes, include your reasoning with your subclaims. Yep, explain your reasoning throughout the entirety of your essay. Always explain your reasoning. That's going to be really important. In terms of convincing argument versus historical knowledge, you have to have historical knowledge to make a convincing argument in an AP World History course. This isn't a rhetoric rubric. The rubric is about historically defensible, so it has to be plausible, and it's about using evidence to support the argument. So having the convincing argument is good, but if your evidence doesn't link to it, or if your evidence isn't specific, right, if you don't have that historical knowledge, it doesn't really matter. That said, if all you're doing is just listing a bunch of historical facts to prove how much you know, that's also not going to work. It's really a both and. It's a convincing argument using historical knowledge, which is part of what makes this so very difficult. All right, we're at 9 o'clock. I've hit my 1 hour mark. That means it is midnight for my East Coast people, and you all need to get some sleep, especially if you are writing in class tomorrow. But I will stay for one more question. So whoever types the fastest gets to ask me one more question, and then I'm sending y'all off to bed, please. Also, keep an eye on your email and on Fiveable for our upcoming DBQ streams. We've got teachers breaking down all these different components. Thesis people, that's our next upcoming stream. That is next Tuesday. So tune in next Tuesday about thesis. We're also going to talk about evidence in a separate stream. We're going to talk about context in a separate stream. And I'll be back in 2 weeks talking about analysis and reasoning, so sourcing and complexity. Thanks for tuning in with us tonight. The DBQ is a beast of a topic, and we are right at the beginning of this process. We're going to do a lot more work on this here in Fiveable and hopefully in your classrooms as well to get you really ready to tackle this on the exam in May. So have a great night, get some sleep, and I'll see you in the next stream.